Very often when we think about trauma, we think about big events. We think about things like natural disasters. We think about tragic instances of some kind of abusiveness in relationships, early developmental traumas. And those are the external traumas of life. And the focus often is on that. I think when it comes to truly understanding the impact of trauma, though, we need to think about what's going on the inside of a person. And especially in relation to priests and presbyteros, think about the inner life and inner experience of the priest and the presbytera. How they experience and respond to the everyday rhythms of ministry and what they encounter as they try and carry out very difficult work. So, for trauma in the life of a priest and of a presbytera, in as much as they are connected to each other and living their lives together and trying to make life work, what we need to understand is that there are really four things that any person needs to have buffers against trauma, to not be overwhelmed by it. I'm going to name them, and we can think about whether or not these things are available to our priests and presbyteros. There's training. Training is a way of differentiating between what's novel and what's dangerous. And if it's dangerous, how to respond to it, how to bring skills to it, how to bring protective aspects to it. So if there's training in place, it gives a person a buffer and a leg up on not being overwhelmed on the inside, but even by traumatic events. We see this a lot in military, in first responders. They are people who are trained to differentiate between novel and dangerous. The second thing is we need to be surrounded by a group of colleagues who do what we do, who are able to validate and be attuned to the everyday stresses that go along with what happens. That way, we never get isolated or feel like there's something wrong with us when inevitably we respond to difficult situations. So training in a community of colleagues and peers. The third thing we need is, frankly, some of us come to the table with pre-existing vulnerabilities to trauma. Our own developmental backgrounds, our own growing up, or our own life histories contain something traumatic that has had an impact, so that subsequent traumatic events create a trigger almost into some of the worst emotional and mental aspects of that original trauma. In that case, we need a more specialized kind of mental health intervention. Psychotherapy, psychopharmacology, things like that. The fourth thing, which is the most general but maybe the most important and the most anciently understood, is love. Now, it sounds simple in a way, but it's scientifically validated. The human brain is so inherently relational and social, and from the very first moments of life, if there isn't a relationally secure, attuned, consistent, loving presence, development goes awry. That doesn't change when we become adults. We can certainly be sturdier, hardier, we develop, but we never stop needing the healing, buffering aspects of loving relationships, gentleness, tenderness, understanding, connection to meaning in life that comes from being deeply connected to other people. It is buffering and helps people deal with the inevitable traumas of life. So our study at the Danielson Institute had over 200 responses from throughout the Archdiocese of both priests and presbyteros, about approximately an equal number of each of them. And of that sample of respondents, 80% of them, so let's say 160 of the 200, reported experiencing something in the last 6 months that they experienced as overwhelming and difficult to manage from an emotional perspective. So something traumatic. 80% of them. Out of that 80%, 50% of them, so 40% of the whole sample, so let's say that would be 80 people of the 200, reported symptoms that were clinically mapped onto a post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. Now, because we didn't do clinical interviews and things like that, we can't give that diagnosis. But the symptoms that they endorsed on the instruments that we administered mapped onto a clinically relevant diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. 40%. That's 2 or 3 times higher than active military and first responders who have training, who have colleagues, who have availability of mental health resources. Now, I don't want to idealize that, but consider the numbers. 2 or 3 times higher than active military and first responders. So there are 2 ways of thinking about post-traumatic stress symptoms. One way to think about them is the individual. Now that means a couple different things. It means in terms of everyday life, avoiding anything that is going to trigger those emotions that are so painful to begin with. So if there are stressful symptoms within the parish, the priest and the presbytera are going to tend to pull back and pull away because they are already experiencing clinical levels of distress. If there are on a regular basis intense feelings of depression or anxiety or emotional dysregulation, just not feeling right, then the risk is they're going to take shortcuts to try to cool off the fires of the dysregulation. And we're all familiar with what those shortcuts are. They're more compulsive behaviors, substances, binge watching television so that hours and hours pass by, gambling, shopping, eating. All these things affect our inner chemistry in a way that give us a short-term sense of relief, but there's a rebound effect, and that rebound then requires a greater dose of the shortcut in order to feel better the next time. And you can see how addictive cycles then get set in motion in these ways. And the brain chemistry around opiate use and alcohol use and binge watching TV and gambling are so similar because they all affect the pleasure centers of the brain. They cool things off temporarily, but they don't last, and then you need a bigger hit the next time. I want to be absolutely clear that our priests and presbyteres are not some superhuman race other than the rest of the people in the community. They are flesh and blood and respond with hearts and minds in the same way that we do to traumatic stress. What's layered onto them, though, is that they're absorbing the stress, traumatic stress, from a whole community. And they're doing it within structures that don't necessarily provide them with the training or with the buffers of regular colleague and peer contact or with the mental health resources that they need in order to carry that out. And let's not forget the 4th thing that they need, and that is they need to be loved. The parish council is key to the well-being of the priest. That comes from the data from our study. Because when parish councils were at odds with their priests, it fell right into this traumatic area of trying to manage life. Because when the parish council is at odds with the priest, it threatens their sense of well-being, it threatens the security of their family and their position. If there are children involved and they're in school or have special needs or are just settled into life in a community, when there's a disruption between the relationship with parish council and priest, it affects everything. So one thing is be aware of that. Sometimes parish councils may feel like they don't have adequate influence or power, or they're not sure how to negotiate things with the priest. I assure you, the parish council has profound influence and power in relation to the priests. The second thing is be aware of the vulnerabilities, the risk factors that the priest and presbytera are living with. Be aware of that and be an ally and a strategist with them to structure ministry and the rhythms of their life of work and rest, of time away, of time of renewal. Help them get more training. It's a good investment. Help them connect with their peers. It's a good investment. Help them locate mental health services if they need to. It's a good investment. And love them. The parish council can do all four of those. All four of those, and it will make a big difference. Each of us probably doesn't have to look too far into our own hearts and minds to realize that the person of the priest holds a kind of special place in our spiritual life, in our hopes to grow, in our hopes for our communities to thrive, for those of us who are parents, in our hopes for our children to stay connected to the church. The priest gets uniquely, if you will, loaded up with the disparate hundreds of hopes, expectations, fears, suspicions that go with any person of influence. What I hope we can be more aware of is that that influence is reciprocal. And there's no way that a priest can possibly know what those expectations are. So if we can get clearer about what it is we want and what we need, and be aware that we're putting too much expectation there almost all the time, so that we can then take a step back and be clear about what the priest is actually there for. What are they there to do, and how can I help them carry that out? That gives them so much better chance to be effective, healthy, alive, and awake to the needs of their community than if they have to try to manage hundreds of expectations that they can't possibly figure out and solve. It doesn't mean they shouldn't work sensitively on a pastoral basis. But if we as communities can be clear about what it is the priest is there to do, and then support that, we'll all be more awake and alive in our churches. So there was a recent study carried out by the Lilly Foundation. All that they looked at were clergy who participated in peer groups that were supportive. They then did outcome studies on things like church attendance, stewardship, and satisfaction within the parish. Based on just having access to peers, every one of those measures went up. The communities will be more healthy and will thrive if the priests and the presbyteres are thriving. I say this with utmost seriousness because it's going to sound a little cheesy and rah-rah. We are in this together. Priest and community is not two separate things. It's Christian community. And if our priests, presbyteres, and their families are suffering in this way, I promise you, the communities are suffering equally. When one part of the body suffers, the whole body suffers. So to the degree that we're making sure that each part of the body is being attended to and is healthy and doing all that it was made to do by God, then the whole community has that opportunity as well.